Good afternoon. Welcome to Smithsonian Gardens. This is our inaugural event, and we're so excited to have you join us. First, my name is Cindy Brown. I am the Manager of Education and Collections at Smithsonian Gardens. And today, our program is Making Homes for Native Bees. And our presenter is Dr. Holly Walker. She is the Plant Health Manager at Smithsonian Gardens. Dr. Walker received her doctorate in entomology from the University of Delaware. And I'm going to turn this presentation over to Dr. Walker now. And please inform us on what we need to know about making homes for native bees. Thank you.
Excellent. Can you guys hear me all right? I guess you can't really respond.
Yes, I can hear you, so
Okay.
They can hear you as well.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you guys very much for being here today. I really appreciate it. This is my first time doing this type of webinar, and I really love the opportunity to talk about something I'm very passionate about, very interested in, and I hope that a little bit of that gets over to you and maybe spark some interest in this kind of stewardship that can come from even small gardens. So our talk today is about making homes for native bees. This is a very large and broad topic, and I know many of you have probably seen other webinars. We're going to try and keep it a little bit simple, but I really hope that I can answer some of the questions that you guys have about what is the process of maybe creating space in your own gardens from inviting these native bees in. So I'm just going to give you a brief outline of what we're going to talked about today. So I hope this is what you tuned in for. We're going to talk a little bit about the native bees themselves, and we're going to talk about their biology. We're going to talk about what is appropriate for the homes of native bees and what other things we can do to encourage habitat for them. There's a wide variety of native bees out there, and there's a lot of different tactics that we can follow that will support them and really improve their lives. But also the other point I would like to make today is the importance of pollinators in general. I don't know if many of you guys know, but next week is National Pollinator Week. It's a very important time to really kind of reinvest in that want to protect pollinators. So this is a good opportunity to talk about a very specific group of pollinators in our lives that probably go very unnoticed. And then the last thing I'm going to do is kind of a little project. It's very simple for just making your own little mason bee house. And we'll go over just some very simple steps with that. And then at the end, I'll take your questions. So let's get into our native bees, or just in general bees all over the world. When you think about how many bees are in the world, maybe some of you guys have seen these stats before, but there's roughly 20,000 species of bees worldwide. And while to some people that may seem like a lot, when you think about the diversity of plants and other insects in the world, it's actually kind of small. There's 350,000 known species of beetles. There's 250,000 roughly known species of plants. So when you think about all the plants and different species that there are in this world, and then the fact that there are like 12 and a half more plant species than there are bee species in this world, it means that our bees have a very big job cut out for them. That being said, I would like to point out that bees are not the only pollinators out there. There are plants that are wind pollinated. There are plants that have mammals as pollinators. So bees are not the only pollinators, but they are actually one of our big primary pollinators. Bees have evolved over time to have special structures specifically for pollination. Excuse me. And so that really does put a lot of weight on them in terms of being a genera that supports productions of seed, supports our food. So it's really neat to think about so few bees in this world really support these ecosystems. And then take that number and look at the United States itself. The United States only has roughly 4,000 bee species. That's 1/5 of the world. And actually most of our bee species, a lot of our diversity is out west. It's not even here where I'm located in the mid-Atlantic Northeast kind of region. So it's really kind of fascinating that so few bees are doing so much work. But again, the neat thing about them is there's so much that we can do for them to encourage them to be around. And the great thing is that bees also can be generalist and specialist. And I don't know if you've heard these terms before, maybe you have. Specialists tend to go to the same species. So a specialist bee will only specialize on certain flowers, on certain plants, whereas a generalist is going to visit more widely different types of flowers and flower species. So it's really kind of nice that we have both of these groups, because sometimes we have plants that have really unique structures that you just wonder how on earth is something going to pollinate that. But then you have a lot of flowers that have these very open platforms that it seems very easy to see how they're going to be pollinated. All right. So let me just adjust my screen. One of the big things I hope you get out of this is understanding that you have the ability to make a difference in the lives of native bees. And I'm going to go over a bunch of different bees, but the ones I'm going to focus on a lot today, because it's the ones that I feel like we have the most impact in terms of what we can do in terms of creating habitat and structure for them. It's very easy and very visible, is what we consider our mason bees. And so obviously bees are facing a lot of challenges right now. And bees are very adaptable, but with their environment changing, climate changing, those types of things around them, they're really having a lot of stresses. And so the easiest things we can do is to continue to build habitat back in. And as I was saying before, mason bees, which usually are in this family Megacalidae, and even some of these small carpenter bees, we often think of them as the ones that use these tubes or these hollow stems. So that's the group that we're talking about. You'll also think about things like leafcutter bees. They're also the types who will use these hollow stems. And for both mason bees and leafcutter bees, they don't actually make their own holes compared to a carpenter bee. Carpenter bees actually chew out their own holes, whereas a mason bee or a leafcutter bee has to use resources that are already available to them. But again, as I was saying before, native bees are so important to us. I'm not going to say that honeybees do not have an important role. They do, but honeybees are a little bit different for us. They're kind of like an agricultural commodity. We manage them in different ways. Native bees have evolved alongside with the plants that we have in our region, and they're adapting to these changes as well with these plants. That's part of their evolution that they've come through. And so they're going to be very efficient pollinators for the native plants and ecosystems that we have here. But they also will take advantage of other non-native plants that are in the area, but they're very efficient pollinators. So going back to the mason bees, there's 140 species of Osmia in North America. And again, this is the group that kind of encompasses these mason bees. So, take that 4,000 and dwindle it down even further to this 140 species just here in North America. But they're still doing so much work. One of the big things I always get questions about mason bees is, can they sting you? In most cases, bees can sting you. Males cannot, because the stinger is actually a modified ovipositor. However, that said, it's very rare for people to be stung by mason bees. Mason bees are very non-aggressive, and you're very unlikely to encounter a female and be in a situation where you would ever get stung. So these are not bees that you should be concerned about in terms of getting stung. They tend to be solitary bees, which means that each female is her own queen in a sense. She does all the work by herself. But it can be noted that sometimes they group together. So if you start making your own bee houses, you're going to notice that there's groups of females who tend to build in holes that are very close to each other. And I don't know if this is a protective feature or not, but it's really neat to watch as they kind of semi-aggregate, but this isn't always the case. And a lot of times you'll just see one individual female, building her little mud packing into various tubes. These are excellent pollinators. One of the things I actually want to point out, particularly in this image, is notice where the pollen is being carried. So again, I was talking about the fact that bees have evolved to become pollinators. And the neat thing about many different bees is that they've evolved these structures to help them carry pollen and move pollen around, a lot of times referred to as a scopa. And these structures can occur in different places. Honeybees often have things like what's called a pollen basket on their legs. And most bees actually have pollen scopa or pollen baskets on their legs. But specifically with mason bees, they have these structures on the underside of their abdomen. And this is actually a really good feature when you think about pollination, because look at all the pollen that's on the underside of that bee. And when they go to land on another flower, they're going to scrape off more pollen. They're going to be more efficient pollinators that way. And this is such a good structure for them to be able to be such efficient and useful pollinators, especially because a lot of these mason bees are now being used in agricultural settings, particularly for fruit crops in the spring. So again, we think about honeybees, but really we should be focusing on some of our own native bees who are fantastic pollinators. I know this image is a little hard to see, and I'm not expecting you to, be able to read the whole thing, but I am going to talk a little bit about the mason bee life cycle, because I think most of us are familiar more with honeybees and their life cycle, and the fact that honeybees don't go dormant, and that they're active for large portions of the year. It's very different for most of our native bees, and particularly for our mason bees. Mason bees are actually inside their cocoons most of the year. They're actually only active as adults, maybe about 2 months, a couple of weeks in the very early spring. That said, I do want to point out, there are other native bees that are active through other parts of the year. So don't always just focus on the spring. But if you're specifically interested in rearing and helping mason bees, you need to really focus your efforts so that these adults are being fed, are being housed in the spring with clean materials. So we're looking at times, particularly where the part of the country I'm in, like mid-March through maybe early June, mid-June at the absolute latest. But this can change a little bit. And again, don't be concerned if you see native bees outside of this time period. It's just different species. The larvae are going to actually live inside these cocoons that the females prepare for them, and they're going to spend pretty much the entire summer that way. So really, you're not going to see them active. And then they're going to pupate in the fall. And hopefully we'll have adults who are inside of these cocoons just waiting for that spring to come back around again. And so what they're doing is they're waiting until temperatures get to about 50 degrees consistently before they're going to start coming out. We generally tend to see males coming out first, and they kind of wait for the females. They get themselves positioned and ready. And then when the females come out, they mate and the cycle begins again. And remember, these aren't colonies. Each female is her own individual queen, her own individual worker. She is responsible for all of the offspring for the following year, which she will never see. She dies not long after she finishes her task of feeding and making these little cocoons for all of her larvae and her eggs. So it's a really interesting life cycle, and it's based on a lot of, I don't want to say hope, but it kind of is. You know, it's one of these ideas that she has no idea if these offspring are going to make it, but she's done everything in her ability to prepare them and protect them for the following year. The other group I really want to talk about is ground nesting bees. I'm going to spend a little bit less time on these guys just because there's the things you can do for them, particularly in your own garden, is a little bit less, but that's okay. You know, we're still able to help them out through the things that we do for our mason bees and our other native bees. So ground nesting bees actually make up the highest proportion of bee species. And these are guys who are living in the ground. They usually have little tubes and tunnels or things that you see. They can have chambers that go down into the ground. And they're really kind of neat. And they're actually a wide diversity of bees. When I say ground nesting bees, it's not one particular family. You know, these images in particular can show you an Andrena bee, a Coletes, a Halictid. They have various sizes, looks to them. I love the super metallic colors of the Halictids, super tiny. Most people think that they're just little flies buzzing around, but they're absolutely gorgeous. They're often referred to as like sweat bees, but they're fascinating. I also love like the Coletes because they're just super furry in the face. It's just such a cool look to them. And you see their little faces popping out of their little holes in the ground. And again, these are also solitary bees. And again, they can be gregarious where they have homes, hives, or tunnels next to each other. And again, these aren't aggressive bees. You know, we have this stigma around bees being aggressive because we often think of swarming, honeybees, or, you know, we often mistake wasps for bees. But really, a lot of these guys are just trying to get to work, get things prepared, and get ready for that next generation. So again, not something that you should be afraid of. Now with these guys in particular, they need access to open soils. A lot of times sandy soils, dry soils, you don't want it to be so wet that it's too muddy for them, which is funny because our mason bees need the mud, but our ground nesting bees need the sand and the soil. And so it's actually really easy sometimes in your garden to just clear some space away. You don't need a lot of mulch. You don't want anything like really heavy on there, but you just need to give them a little bit of bare ground in which they can create these nests. And don't be afraid when you start seeing these holes popping up, because they're just going to be there trying to, you know, again, the same thing that the mason bees are doing, which is to create these little hollows of eggs so that they can provision them with food for the next generation. I love this image, and I definitely highly encourage everybody, if you get the opportunity and you're interested in bees, particularly native bees, to check out the USGS Bee Inventory and Monitoring Lab. They have done phenomenal work, you know, capturing these high-res images of our native bees. And I love this one. So this is our blue orchard bee, which is one of our mason bees, but it's used very much for pollination in orchards because obviously it's a good tree, fruit tree pollinator. But I love the colors in them. I just think that the metallics are really stunning, and that so often we miss this because we see them just buzzing by very quickly. We don't really get a moment to see them for what they are. Sorry, I'm just making sure I'm staying on point. All right, so the next part of this talk is one that I think is very important to have because it's offering up a lot of questions right now. People ask me a lot of times about bee homes, particularly the ones that you can buy in stores or the ones that you can make for yourself. but particularly the ones that you find in stores. And I have been gifted many of these in my life, especially in the last few years. And I've come to start assessing them a little bit and seeing like what's good about them, what's not so great about them, and how they can be altered. Oh, and another quick point before I get going. There is a difference between a mason bee house and an insect hotel. And these serve two different functions. While there can be some overlap in them, don't expect them to do the same thing. One is specifically designed for the rearing of mason bees. The other one is designed to create a safe haven and habitat and ecosystem for other arthropods, including insects, including bees, if they can use it. But don't expect that to be the only thing that lives there. And that's not a bad thing. That's a very good thing. But you got to be prepared for having different types of visitors. So let's get back to the mason bee houses. Specifically in this situation, tubes are too small. Without fail, almost every single bee house I've been gifted at this point or gotten myself or looked at, the tubes are too short. We have found out that tubes need to be at least 6 inches long. And there's a reason for this. Mason bees tend to stack their eggs in a particular order, with females in the back and males at the front. And there's a reason for this. Males emerge first, so they need to kind of clear the way for the females to eventually come out. And the problem is that for some reason, when the tubes are too short, the females only lay male eggs. That's great, except there's no females for another generation. So we definitely need to make sure that the tubes are long enough so that that female for this year is laying more female eggs for the following year. Because again, that's the only way the population is going to increase. The other thing is to have a backing. I know it seems kind of counterintuitive, but it's actually really nice to have a protected back on these because it limits the ways in which predators can get to them. And so, you know, having a board, a plastic container on the back, if you're using bamboo or reed, so that there's a node or a knot or something that stops it so that there's actually like a wall, a physical wall inside of there. These are all really good things to think about when you're thinking about building your own mason bee house. And if you have a mason bee house, most of the ones that are available, they do have a back to them. But if it's just tubes going straight through and there's no point in which that cuts off, you may want to create one. The other thing I found about a lot of these mason bee homes is that you can't remove the tubes, and that's not good. It's great for a year. But if you want to replace and buy a new one every year, that's what you're going to have to do. And I don't like that in particular. I always try and use sustainable methods when creating spaces and habitat for bees. And the same thing with making bee houses. You need to be able to take the tubes out. You need to be able to clean them. If they're actually, we'll talk about trays in a minute too. Trays are great. They're a good alternative for being able to clean these spaces out. But this is just a hygienic thing for bees. Because if you continue to use these same tubes over and over and over again without cleaning them out, you're inviting bacteria, disease, funguses, parasites to really attack these bees, and eventually it can overwhelm the house that you have. And instead of creating a good safe space for them, you're actually creating kind of a biological trap for them. So, you know, again, being able to remove tubes. If you have a house that already has tubes in place and you can't pull them out, one of the things you can do is actually stick paper rolls inside of it, like very thin paper, and fill the tubes and then pull those out safely. And then do that. But again, it's really nice if you can actually pull the tubes out completely and really clean them. The other thing is, a lot of the times they show these things hanging free in the wind. And that's not good for them either. Bees don't want to be knocked around any more than we want to be knocked around, especially in a heavy storm. So you need to make sure that these houses are going in protected places and aren't just like these freestanding, free-moving kinds of things. So what does make a good bee home? So here are some examples of some various types of bee houses. And this is definitely not the full range. There's such a diversity of bee houses out there. And I'm not going to tell you what the best ones are or not, because really we don't know. And there's different things that are going to work for different places. I think it's important to realize that you do what you can in the space that you have. And it's really good to start with maybe something simple. And as you grasp it, get a little bit further each year and keep moving forward with it, you know, and add a different element to it. But again, as I was saying before, the best thing that, and probably the most important thing you should consider when you're making a bee house or buying one is, are these tubes going to be removable, or can I use these trays? These trays have been developed, and as you can see, they come apart very easily, but they're still protected. And you know, you can actually see the individual cocoon casings. And in this case, you'll see larvae in each one of these little like tubes, but it's really easy to kind of monitor and clean at the end of the season. So again, remember that your tubes need to be at least 6 inches long. And the other thing I was going to say, and I forgot to add it onto the slide here, is you can use a variety of different hole sizes. But I find that most places, particularly who support commercially with mason bees, is 5/16 of a hole size is the best. But again, diversity of sizes is good because that's diversity of species. Just, I would warn you on the side of not getting too big. Too big starts to include, you know, wasps and other predators and really wants them to get involved. So actually, these guys tend to be a little bit better on the smaller side. Some other things you really need to think about is solid foundation. As I was saying before, you don't want these guys kind of like going all over in the wind. Sorry, checking my time. And so you want to make sure that the frame of the house is sturdy in and of itself. Now that said, I have built houses out of plastic bottles. I've built them out of tin cans. But if you have the opportunity, try to create a really stable structure in which you're going to house your tubes or your trays that you're going to use for these mason bees. The other thing is that a lot of times people forget about a roof. And I know it seems silly because you don't see roofs out in nature, but that is important because the tubes that you're using, and depending on what types of tubes you use, moisture becomes a big issue. And if you're constantly letting wetness, mold, rain, those types of things, it's going to get really nasty very quickly. And if it gets too soggy, you know, it's going to kill those new bees. The other thing is make sure that your house is attached to something solid. If you can attach it to a wall, if you need to attach it to a tree, some people build specific posts for them. There's a lot of different ways to do this. You know, even if it's hanging by a ribbon or a twine, there are ways to help kind of secure this house so that it's, you know, not just blowing around in the wind. One of the things I've seen that I really like as I've looked at more of the designs that people are coming out with is this idea of 2 compartments. And I'll explain a little bit more about that, but it's kind of nice to have either a diversity of tubes and trays or different, you know, materials that you want to incorporate into it. Or if you want to, remove the tubes from the year prior, put them into one portion of it, and then put fresh tubes out, because there's going to be this kind of critical overlap period in which you're going to have your mason bees emerging, and then you're also going to need them to have fresh tubes to come into to be able to start laying their eggs. Some other requirements that occur with, particularly with mason bees and leafcutter bees, mud. So again, the common name gives them away in the sense that these are mason bees. And so what they do is they have these eggs and these little food provisions. And to create each one of these little cells, they create a mud wall, a little mason wall. If they don't have that, they're not going to lay in that area. So actually just having a little like patch of mud somewhere is actually very good for these types of bees. Now, if they're not the traditional mason bees and they're maybe leafcutter bees, then you're going to see a different kind of situation, which is if you've ever had roses or lilacs or certain plants that are very favorable to leafcutter bees, you're going to know these little perfect cutouts, little circular notches all around the edges of your plant. And what this is this is the female leafcutter bee. And as you can see one here on the right-hand side, she's got a perfect little cutout of a leaf, and she's going to use that to create her little cocoon for her individual eggs. And it's really kind of a fascinating thing if you've ever found these little like leaf cocoons and they're just stacked one right after the other. But it's really good, you know, it's really amazing that these bees are capable of such detailed structures and protective structures. And again, when I was talking about our ground nesting bees, so these are non-cavity nesting bees, it's ground nesting bees. Having these sandy, bare soil kinds of areas. Again, I just love seeing them when they pop out of their little holes in the ground. Rearing. This is something that goes into a little bit of debate, but there's definitely one aspect of this that's very important. So if you are going to go forward with creating your own mason bee home, then you know, you need to make sure that you are replacing those tubes every year. I know I keep saying it, it's a really important thing. This is a hygienic kind of situation. Some people choose to take the tubes out and will actually open them so that they can inspect the cocoons themselves. If you look at the picture on the far bottom, those are the cocoons, and you can actually see parasitic wasps that are landing on those cocoons and have probably parasitized the insects inside of them. That's not terrible, it definitely can be a problem. The one at the top, you can actually see mites are covering that particular cocoon. So these are all problems that you kind of want to inspect for when you're looking. Now, you don't have to open the tubes. If you're not comfortable with it, if you're afraid you're going to damage them, it is okay to just, you know, collect the tubes out of your house in the fall and in the winter, maybe put them in a box or some place that's safe, but that they'll eventually be able to emerge out of in the spring. And then just make sure that you replace your house with fresh tubes so that it's ready to go by, like I said, mid-March. I would actually say start prepping in February, because the last few years, at least here, we've had a particularly warm spring or warm winter leading into spring. So, you know, you want to have the house ready for when the bees are getting out there, which is about 50 degrees, you know, temperature wise. So what else can you do? This is the bigger picture stuff. If you're not yet at that point of wanting to, you know, create your own bee home or make these spaces, there's a lot of other things that you guys can do to, you know, help support these bees. All right, still doing good. All right, so what do you do? I think the biggest thing that most of us do and love and enjoy doing is planting more flowers. You know, the primary food source for most of these insects is nectar and pollen. So having that there and having that available is what's going to draw them in. You know, a lot of people, when they first put up their bee homes, they're concerned because they don't see them in the first year or two. And sometimes it's just getting the resources right and having the bees find it. But the easiest thing that you can do is to start planting gardens and kind of creating these spaces for them. They'll get there, but you know, you need to kind of make the right environment. You know, build it and they will come situation. Now, I would love to have this. I would love to be able to have a meadow and a field and just be able to plant whatever plants I wanted to, big open skies. But I don't. I have this. I live in a small apartment. I have a very tiny balcony, and you can see not all my plants are pollinator plants. I have all kinds. I inherit all types, though my squash plants seem to do very well with the pollinators. But you know, the thing is that people always worry that because they don't have a lot of space that they can't make an impact. And actually, a lot of the research out there says that it is the small gardens that make a big impact, because a lot of times bees are in environments that aren't particularly good for them. So when they have these little safe havens and these refuges to go to, they can be an important kind of life-saving or, you know, protecting tool for them. So building your little balcony garden, having your little window garden is a good thing. And if you have more space, great. Use it, you know, any way that you can. It's really kind of neat that, again, bees are one of those groups that a lot of times we can't make a huge impact on the local level, but bees we can, and we can do simple things that will really bring back the diversity that we hope for and create stronger ecosystems. I found this list of plants for mason bees. So I wanted to point out again that mason bees in particular, and a lot of our native bees, are early spring pollinators that come out very early in the year. So you kind of want to shift gears a little bit, make sure that you are planting a little more heavily in the spring for them. And there's some really great families out there. Like I said, our blue orchard bee is great for cherries, apples, you know, any of our flowering fruit trees. One of the other ones is blueberries. Blueberries is a great one. We actually have a blueberry specialist who's a native bee of ours. So try and think about these as a possibility. But I also would say to you, make sure you plant a diversity of different flower shapes. Talked a little bit about this, but you know, bees can be specialists and flowers can be kind of specialists as well. They create these really unique structures, and certain bees are going to be much better at pollinating them than other ones. So make sure that you're planting in a way that, you know, is going to bring in the biggest diversity that you can. That said, I understand if you have a small space, you're not going to be able to have that much diversity. One of the things they always say is, you know, in my balcony, I can usually only have 1 or 2 of any one plant species. But if you have more space, you should probably plant in clusters, usually about 3 or 4 if you can, because the larger that a patch is, the more likely it is to attract the attention of the bees that you're looking for. So yeah, definitely look at different diversity of shapes and colors. You know, bees tend to go more on the white, the light pinks, but different pollinators will be attracted if you want to incorporate more bright and bold colors into your garden as well. Again, you want to attract as many pollinators as you can. You know, it's a good resource for all. This is always the big point. I know that I'm talking a lot about our native bees being early in the spring, but I still think that it's important to plant what I call as a full season garden. One of the other things is plant, not just for the early spring, plant for the fall. I'm always surprised how late flowers are still blooming here in this part of the country. And, you know, I see flowers all the way sometimes through November and December, depending on how warm it's been. And some plants that are native to this area are really well adapted to hang in for a long time. The other thing is make sure that you're leaving up stems if you can, especially if you know that it's a plant that has hollow stems, because that's the natural habitat. Like if you can't and don't want to, build one of these houses, the best thing you can do is plant plants that are going to have hollow stems at the end of the season and leave them up. You can trim them in the spring after the bees have emerged. Like I said, they come out so early. You still have plenty of time to get your garden or your plants in shape before they're getting ready to bloom and flower again. And if you still feel like you need to cut them down, cut them at the top, cut them at the bottom, and then lay them down so that you're not shredding the material where the bees might potentially be inside. So that's a really good way to kind of create habitat all year round for them. The other thing is we tend to focus on flowering plants, and that's because it's easy. It's easy to get like a potted garden and, you know, create a bunch of very easy, beautiful annuals and perennials that are flowering. But other things, if you have the room for it, and even in pots, I do this, shrubs. I can't do trees, but I like to support trees. Trees are great pollinator plants, particularly for our bees. So it's a neat thing to be able to say, hey, what should I plant for native bees? And tell people that they should be planting more trees and more shrubs. So think sometimes outside of the box a little bit and think about some of the other things that are out there that are important to our pollinators. But again, try to think about a full season if you can. You know, and go to markets, go to gardens, go to our garden and visit us and see what we're doing through different parts of the year, because we definitely care about this. And we want to make sure that we've got a beautiful display of flowers all year, but that it's also supporting our local insects, ecosystems, and pollinators. Leave out the pesticides, please. I know it's hard. I know it's hard. And you know it's hard to watch that beautiful plant of yours that you just bought and it's being decimated. Those aphids are terrible. Those mealybugs are everywhere. But if you can tolerate it, most plants are actually very well equipped to tolerate high levels of pests. It does depend on the pest, and there are times when it is important to step in. But there's a lot of great alternatives out there, and a lot of times it's mechanical and cultural controls. Choosing a different plant, doing something physical like crushing them or spraying them off with water, or just let nature take its course. Try and bring in the beneficials. Try to encourage, you know, the ladybird beetles. Try and encourage your lacewings. There's so many things out there, especially with aphids. Everything eats aphids. But the more you can hold back on pesticides, the better off you're going to be for bees, because they're moving around so much. They're getting a little bit of it everywhere, and then they're bringing these back, especially if it's a honeybee. But if in the cases of the mason bees and native bees, they're actually incorporating this into the food that they're going to feed their offspring, and that can really damage their health. You know, we're seeing declines in native bee populations just as we're seeing declines in honeybee populations. It's a little bit different, but at the same time, it's still something that we should be really concerned about and something we should be, you know, kind of taking a stance on a little bit. And if you need to, find alternatives. Like I said, there's biological controls. I know a lot of people want to use organic. Just be careful. I always point out, even though organics tend to be a little bit safer, they can still harm honeybees, or not honeybees, but they can still harm bees in general. And so it's important to pay attention to what you're using. They do tend to be safer, but you still need to make sure that it's appropriate for the space that you're using it. And also try not to spray anything that's flowering if you have to spray. You know, and it's not just insecticides, fungicides, and everything else. So, you know, all these things, they're just getting added into their system. So yeah, if you can, leave out the pesticides. So I was talking before about the fact that this is mostly about native bees, but I think it's important to talk to you guys about the fact that by doing this, you're creating habitat for more than just native bees. You are creating habitat for a lot of the other insects and pollinators that we need in this world. Because as I said, not all flowers are pollinated by bees, and they do get the help and support of other pollinators. This slide in particular shows a diversity of flies. Yes, even the one on the far right is a fly. They're all great mimics, usually bee mimics. Most of these are hoverflies. I love them very much. I love them in particular because they're beneficials as well. When hoverflies are, or flower flies, whatever you prefer, when they're immatures, they are predatory on things like aphids. So much like our ladybird beetles and our lacewing larvae, these guys are also predatory, and they're fantastic, and you should want them in your gardens. Obviously, this is the most charismatic of them all. I love bees. And, you know, butterflies are interesting and fascinating, and I care very much for what's happening to them. But remember that these guys are all sharing a different ecosystem, or sharing the same ecosystem, and that by promoting one, you're going to get the other. And I know for a lot of people, this is what they're hoping to attract. But I hope that you look past, you know, not just at the butterflies, look to the small guys, look to the little tiny bees that, again, you thought were just flies hovering around your flowers. Remember that if you see all of these things in the same place, you're creating a really good ecosystem for them, hopefully. So I talked about a project. This is just kind of a fun project. I don't know if you just want something fun to do, if you have the materials on hand, or you can come up with them. As I said, this isn't exactly the right time for mason bees, but it's a fun project that you can do now, especially with pollinator week coming up, and then you'll have it ready to go for next year, and you can have a little bit of time thinking about where you want to put it. So I'm just going to walk you through a very, very simple tutorial for making a very simple mason bee house that you can hang around your house or apartment or balcony like mine. So the first thing you want to do is gather up your supplies. And there's a lot of diversity here. I'm just using what's very easy and available to me. So the first one is you need a container. And again, you want something that's going to be sturdy. You can use plastic bottles. I tend to prefer wooden boxes, even the cheap ones you get like at the dollar store. Just make sure they're not coated with a lot of chemicals and other things like that. And in this case, I'm just using a can out of my recycling. And it has a nice strong back to it. It's very firm, it's strong. It's a little beaten up, but that's okay. And the other thing is you need to figure out what kind of tubes or materials you're going to use. Again, even if you want to include other types of materials that aren't tubes, I always highly suggest you incorporate at least a few in there, since that's going to be the primary thing that they're going to. You can use paper straws, you can use bamboo, you can use hollow reeds. In this case, these tubes that I have here, these cardboard tubes, they're actually sold online. And they're specifically for mason bees, and they're designed so that you can peel them and open them very easily at the end of the season and look inside, which I like. And you can buy big bundles of them and replace them as you need to. So these are specifically mason bee tubes that I'm using here. And again, you can have different sizes if you want to. In this case, I'm just keeping it all one size. Obviously, you want something to hang it with. If you don't have a post, I'm just using a ribbon or a piece of twine. Sorry, I need a drink of water. I've been told I talk too fast. You want to have ribbon or twine. And again, just make sure that it's something that's going to actually be sturdy enough to hold this thing up through the season. You don't want something that's going to rot through. Yeah, just think about the materials that you're putting in there. And like I said, you can gather other types of natural materials, pine cones, leaf litter, those types of things to add into the environment as well. Then you want to pack. And make sure that you're packing these things as tight as you can. I know it seems hard and you're really like, are they actually gonna be able to fit in there, especially if you're using other materials. But you really do need this to stay. You need this to stay all season. So you don't want any of these tubes or pieces falling out. Sometimes it's good if you need to and you don't feel like it's that firm, you can use a little bit of glue right on the edges. Try not to go overboard with it, but just, to kind of secure them. Just remember at the end of the season, you're gonna still have to like pop these out. Or even in the cases with something like this, you can add paper tubes inside of them that pull out as well if that's something you'd rather do. There's a lot of options with this. There's a lot that you can do to make the houses. And I think that's sometimes the hard part is people want a very simple design and they just want you to tell them exactly how to make it. And there's so much diversity to it and you just got to figure out what works for you. Decorate. I think this is the fun part. I like decorating. I think it's a lot of fun. And for the most part, as long as you're not getting it inside the tubes themselves or, coating the outside too much, it shouldn't hurt the bees. And in most cases, depending on the colors that you're using, they shouldn't impact the bees too much as well. Though, I mean, if you want to, it might help you to go a little bit more natural, but most of my houses have been bright and vibrant and colorful. Make sure you attach your ribbon in or string or twine, whatever you choose to use, and then make sure that it won't slip. Again, the last thing you want is for this thing to come down in like a heavy storm or wind, because it could potentially damage the cocoons that are inside. And then make sure you're placing your new bee house. So that's pretty much it. That is it. It is very simple, but make sure you place it in a safe location. A lot of people have talked about like what's the correct height to put these bee houses up. I've heard optimally it's around 6 feet, but that's very tall for some people. I've also heard some people say that it's nice to have it right at like face level so that you can see what's going on. I'm pretty short, but I would still attempt to want to be able to see what's going on, especially because I like to take video and pictures of mason bees when they're coming in and out of their houses. It's much harder than you think. But yeah, again, make sure that it's sturdy. One of the other things is it's important the lighting that you give them, and the lighting has to do with the heat. So again, in the early spring, it's very cold and bees actually need to warm up to a certain temperature before they can even fly. And if they don't reach that temperature, They get out late, they might not get out at all to collect food, and it can really be detrimental to them. So a lot of times they tell you to have it facing south if you can, especially in the early spring because it's not getting that hot yet. And what that does is that allows that early sun to kind of warm up the tubes first, so that those emerging adults are getting out and being able to, go out and forage in the early morning and be very successful in their day. The only thing I would say is just be careful as you get later on into the season. Too much direct light can also really kind of bake them. So, it might not be a bad idea, if possible, when it starts getting really hot, and if you think that your house is getting a lot of too much direct light, is to back it off a little bit and take it to a place, because at that point they're just going to be cocoons and they're going to be larvae inside feeding. You don't need the foraging going on. You don't need those adults who need to get their flight muscles warmed up. So, definitely in the spring, make sure you're facing south and you're getting some of that nice warm morning sunlight. Make sure you're placing them in a protected place with an overhang. In my case, I have my balcony, so I set it just a little bit in from the edge so that, the overhang of my balcony, protects it from direct rainfall, and it's going to get a little bit wet from occasion, and that's okay. But it just needs to have the ability to not get so saturated that it doesn't dry out internally, which is hard, again, when you have that backing on it. And then the other thing is just to try and hang it in a place where there are resources for them. The biggest one being flowers. Again, even if you just do a little planting, a potted planting underneath of your little bee house, that's a really nice thing to do. And don't forget the mud. I know that's a really weird request. Even if you have to make a little dish, just having that little mud set out. And again, you only have to do it in the spring when the adults are out and active. That's the only time they need it. And then the rest of the year you can take it away. So that's actually the end of my formal presentation, but I figure that there's probably going to be a lot of questions. I'm going to do my best to answer them. I am an entomologist. I am not a bee specialist, but I have a great love for this, so I'm going to do my best to help you guys through it. So I'm going to turn it back over to Cindy.
Holly, that was fabulous. So much information. I think we've overwhelmed some of our guests.
I'm sorry.
But no, that's right. That's better than not. So what I've been telling everybody through the chat box is that we are recording this presentation. We'll be putting it on our website so that you'll be able to review it again. And there are so many fabulous questions that have been asked by our participants. There are almost 200 people attending this session today, so we won't be able to get to all the questions, but we will be doing an interview with Dr. Walker and creating a blog that will capture a lot of the images as well as the questions and her answers to go along with this presentation. But in our remaining 15 minutes or so, I thought that I would ask some of the questions that have been presented to us by the audience. And I think it's also very important that some of these questions are very similar, and you have answered some of them during the presentation, but there are some that I think are worth repeating. And the one question that I'm seeing just right now that I think really needs to be clarified is Deborah Dixon asks, these mason bees can be destructive. They have eaten holes in my privacy fence. How do I protect the fence and reserve these species as their habitat? So that's something we want people to allow the bees to come in. So can you answer that question for us, please?
So actually the bees that you're encountering are different types of carpenter bees. There are multiple types of carpenter bees, and most people only think of the large species, but there's actually a very small carpenter bee called Serotina, and they're also one of the ones that can be destructive because mason bees don't chew their own holes in particular. Now that said, I understand the concerns with carpenter bees, and even sometimes with mason bees, people have a lot of issues with them getting into stems of things like roses and stuff, and there are things that you can do. Specifically cover the holes as soon as you're possibly able to. Particularly when I talk to people with like the rose thing, glue, wax, something along those lines. But when it comes to your fences, your balconies, your patios, those types of things, sometimes even just putting down like a very simple like oil treatment, look for something that isn't going to stain, or it's an acceptable stain for you, but those things tend to deter them. I know a lot of people use, I think like linseed oil or clove oils or those types of things. And again, those smells are so strong to them that they're not going to want to continue to be in that type of environment. And again, just making sure that you're, filling the holes as soon as possible so that they're not choosing to come back to these locations, and just keep at it. I know it's frustrating at times, but you just got to make it very apparent to them that this is not a suitable habitat and they can move on to something else. That said, if you have a place in your yard or your garden that you have room, untreated woods that are freshly cut somewhere else that is a good habitat, that's planted with lots of flowers around it, might actually provide an alternative location. But again, you still have to protect what you have at your house, because you don't want them to make that jump of, that's a great habitat, so is this. You want to make sure that you're showing that the places you don't want them to be is where they need to stay out of, but show them places that are acceptable for them to be.
Yeah, and there's another, it's been asked a couple times, and you explained this to me yesterday, and I thought it was a brilliant explanation, that I asked you, why would you want to take these tubes inside? And a person from Wisconsin said, do they need to take the tubes inside to protect them when they're already native bees and they should be acclimated to the area? But why do you do it? And you gave me the explanation of a little house with a attic, and then an area that the new tubes we put in. Can you relate that, please?
Right. Okay. So I know this is a bit of the challenge, or not challenging. This is the confusing part of this. You don't have to bring the tubes inside, but you do want to move them out of one location, or at least have, so this is what I'm talking about, the compartments. It's nice to have a house that has like the main block of tubes. And when those tubes are spent, which you'll see because they'll have mud packed around the front of them, now you know these tubes are occupied. Now, to make space for the clean tubes that you need for the following spring, you're going to want to move these tubes either to another location. Some people create little what they call emergent containers, which can be boxes with a hole in them, plastic containers that also have a hole in them, or, as I was telling Cindy, you can have what's called the upstairs, the attic, and you create in your house a space that is for these tubes that are waiting to emerge while you have fresh tubes underneath. What you're asking me is, why would you bring the tubes inside? As time goes on, I think that people get more interested in the health of their hive and wanting to see how they're doing. Much like honeybees, there are problems that can occur. So this is the mites, the parasites, chalk brood. These types of things can attack these cocoons. And people are often interested in looking at the cocoons, looking at the health of the cocoons, and seeing if it's suitable to put these guys back outside, or if they actually want to stop these things by freezing them. So if you're the type of person who is interested in looking at the health of them, bring your tubes inside. The other thing is, again, the protection side of it is, if you want to put them in a box or something, it just stops other predators from getting to them. Birds are always looking for them, and if it's a material that they can easily crack open, they're keen to crack open these tubes and get what's inside. But if you, like I said, if you can put them in a protected space, that's a good thing. It just adds an extra level of protection. You don't have to do these things. Like I said, for me, I would bring them in. I'd look at the cocoons, make sure that there's no disease, parasites evident. But I will say this, if you do bring your cocoons inside, it needs to stay cold. You need to not bring them into your regular house or apartment where it's warm, because you're going to encourage them to emerge. You need to do this in a cool environment, like an unheated garage or a basement, something that's a little bit protected, but still staying cold, because you need them to go through that natural cold cycle so that they emerge appropriately in the spring. I hope that helped. I hope that explains it.
It was a great explanation for me, so I hope that was very clear to everyone else too. Something else that people are continuing to ask is, what types of plants, again, native plants, non-native plants, should they put into their garden on all different areas? The comments have been made, dandelions, clover, that type of thing, but there's so many different plants that I know that you can add. Do you have an education resource that you could share, maybe from University of Delaware, or where do participants or attendees go to find the native plants in their area?
The two I like the most is Earthsea Society and the National Pollinator Network, which is just pollinators.org. Both of these have what they call regional native plant lists, and they're going to tell you what plants are good for pollinators. Some of them will even tell you which pollinators are best suited to them for your region. So that's the hard part, because I can only talk to those that are in this area. And like Cindy was saying, like the bottom picture is a native bee on a dandelion up close, that very far right bottom picture. Clover is great. And then like I was saying, especially for these native bees, they're such early, they come out so early. So spring ephemerals, flowering trees, those types of things, blueberries, that kind of stuff as well. But there's so much diversity that you can do it. And again, native is, I'm always going to promote native, because native is best, because that's what they've evolved alongside of. And so it's not just good for the bees, it's good for the plants as well. That said, there's a huge area of debate right now in terms of like native cultivars and if they're good or not. And it's very much a mixed bag right now. And a lot of it actually has to do with the genetic changes that you're making to the plant. Are you changing that structure way too much so that bee doesn't understand how to do the pollen? Are you changing the nutritious value of the pollen? So there's a lot of question that's still out on that. That said, there are non-natives that are good nectar producers and pollen producers and are somewhat adjacent to our regions that, you know, even though they're not necessarily native to this area, they can still be beneficial. But you really just need to kind of look at the research, go to those websites, go check out Jersey Society, because this is what they do, or, you know, pollinators.org, and get involved with these groups. They have so much information in terms of the plants. I wish I could give you an entire lecture on just the types of plants, but it would change by region, and it changes so much by the species that you're looking at.
That's so true, Holly. If the participants understand, we've opened this to the nation. We are a national garden. And so we show best what, and know best what grows in our area for native plants and otherwise. But there are so many great organizations out in each one of our states and all over the country where they can go to find information. And I think that's the most important thing. Know what organizations you can go to, educational organizations that will be able to relate the information for your particular area, because we're not all exactly the same. And that's important. I love this one. It says, talk about vegetable gardens a lot or a bit. And that's my specialty. So do you think that bees, having a vegetable garden is something that is very good to attract native bees?
Going back to my one picture, my little squash bee. Oh my God, I love the squash bees. You can just see him inside that squash flower and look at all of the pollen that's in there. You know, obviously some plants are going to be better than others. I mean, look at the types of vegetables that you have and which ones produce a lot of pollen, but I will definitely tell you that bees, I get a lot of attraction from bees from cucumbers and squash and those types of things. You know, it's interesting. I've always wanted to look a little bit more into like tobacco flowers, because I think that there's benefits that they can get from those tobacco flowers. But yes, obviously, the other thing is herb gardens, which is also adjacent to vegetable gardens. And I, you know, generally tend to plant the two hand in hand. Herb gardens are fantastic, you know, dill and cilantro and those types of things. Even though these are tiny flowers, that is what our native bees are really good at. They're really good at those little flowers and getting into those little crooks. And if you have really interesting flowers that a lot of vegetables can have, you know, peas and things, you know, these guys are so adept at getting into these spaces. I didn't talk a lot about bumblebees, but bumblebees have this great and fantastic way of doing buzz pollination, which some plants really need. And that's the only way they get, yeah, exactly. They need that. So they need those bumblebees to be there. And bumblebees are natives, most of them. I do have to point out, I'm talking about our natives, but we have a lot of these species that have been introduced as well. But that said, from our natives, yeah, the bumblebees are fantastic. They're big, beautiful babies. I always freak people out because I can show them how I can pet bumblebees all day long. They're really kind of fantastic. But yeah, we really need their specialization because there are plants that rely on this buzz pollination that they do.
Yeah, you just said you pet them. I used to do that too. I still do, to engage students in gardening. But some of them do bite and some of them do sting. What do we have to do to be able to know the difference, or can we know the difference of which ones? I just don't like to poke anything that I don't know who they are.
That's fair. And that's always the good thing. You should never poke an insect that you don't feel comfortable with and you don't recognize what it is. My favorite one is with carpenter bees in particular. People always, you know, think that they're big bumblebees, and I love pointing out about male carpenter bees. They love to get in your face. The females tend to not do this. The males are, I've watched them chase down cows before because they just think that they're the biggest, baddest thing in the field. But with male bumblebees, if you can look them right in the face, and I know that's hard, nobody wants to stand there and look a bee right in the face, but male carpenter bees have a big yellow or white plate on the front of their face. So if you see a carpenter bee and the face is completely, like the whole thing is dark brown or black, you've got a female. She can sting you. She's unlikely to sting you. The male, however, with his nice big bright yellow nose, as I call it, it's not, he can't sting you. He's a lot of buzz. He's all buzz. He's no sting. That said, it's really hard because, you know, a lot of people can't identify a male or a female on the fly. You know, it's difficult to see them and really tell the difference. And sometimes it's incredibly difficult even when you do have them stationary. Males obviously don't have stingers, as I said before. Females do, and they have ovipositors. But most bees will not sting unless they feel like they have to, or they feel like you're threatening their nest. So be aware of the environment that you're in and look around. See if you're standing on a bunch of holes in the ground. But again, I've never seen mason bees be aggressive, even when people were tromping all over their habitat sites. The other thing is how you respond. You know, I've spent a lot of time around bees. I used to do pollinator surveys out in cranberry and blueberry bogs, particularly cranberry bogs, and spent a lot of time just walking through fields of bees, native and non-native, pollinating. And I've never been stung through that, at least through that. And it's one about the colors you wear. I wouldn't wear this. I wouldn't wear bright colors. Wear neutral colors. That seems to help. They get curious about you if you're bright and colorful and you smell great. They think you're a fantastic flower and they want to know all about you. And that makes most people uncomfortable. So, you know, don't put on your most floral perfume. Don't wear your brightest colors unless you want to come get checked out by a bunch of bees. Another thing is when they come to you, don't run, don't swat, because then they think you're a predator or you're going to hurt them. And, you know, they are definitely more afraid of you than you are of them. But the only thing they've got protecting them is that stinger. So if you can remain calm. I'm out on my balcony a lot, not just with bees, but with wasps. I have a lot of paper wasps on my nest, on my balcony. They're allowed to live there, and we live in peace. And they come and check me out, and then they leave me alone because I mean no harm to them, because I don't swat at them and I don't get real aggressive or, you know, run away from them. I just let them figure it out, and then they go on.
That's great. Yeah, I think that's something we all have to educate people about. I have a couple more and then we're going to have to go, but I want to remind people that we will be posting this webinar on the recorded video on our website, which is gardens.si.edu. I'll get it up as soon as we possibly can. And we also will interview Dr. Walker and with some of the questions that you have that we haven't addressed yet, so that your question will be heard by her and responded to, and that will be on a blog that we'll post as soon as possible as well. We have a small staff, so it might take us a little bit. But I love this question. Do bees sleep in the winter, or do they collect honey in the winter too? I always wondered that. What happens to them?
Well, okay. There's a difference here. So if you're talking about honeybees don't hibernate. They really don't. They go somewhat dormant because they're hanging out inside their hives, but that's always been one of those myths. But honeybees don't hibernate, and they will be active in the winter if it gets warm enough. I've definitely seen them out in January on snowdrops because it was a warm enough day for them. The difference is that with our native bees, and as I was talking about with all these other ones, in the wintertime, they are either puping or they're adults waiting for that 50-degree weather. And it usually takes a few days. So they are sort of dormant. They are kind of hibernating in a sense. I don't know if hibernating is the right term. It's probably more like diapause, which I know doesn't make sense to most people, but essentially they're just in this stage of waiting. So they spend all summer being larvae inside these cocoons, eating. Then they get to fall and they pupate. You know, they go through metamorphosis like many other insects. And then eventually they become adults inside these little cocoons. But they're adults in the winter, mostly. Sometimes it depends on the species, but for the most part, they're not either full adults yet or they're adults in waiting. And essentially they won't come out until those temperatures get warm enough in the spring. So they're just kind of tucked inside their little cocoon blankets, much like we all want to be in the wintertime. And they're just waiting it out, you know, waiting for spring to come and for the flowers to come.
Excellent. Here's another one that too I wondered, because we're a land of mulching and it has taken over. Is it better to leave some bare land, maybe even some sandy land, but some part of the garden that doesn't have any mulch on it, or does it not matter at all?
It is good to leave bare ground. We are
Excellent.
definitely a community and a world of mulchers. And I'm not saying that's bad. It has its purpose and its place, but actually mulch can be really difficult for ground nesting bees. Some obviously can manage it, but a lot of them are really small. And if it's too, difficult or thick for them to get through, this can really hinder them. And a lot of times they set up before you've put that mulch in, and then you've mulched over top of them, and it becomes very difficult for them to get out. So it really is, if you're gonna leave bare areas, leave it bare all year, or leaf litter, leaf mulch, something like that, something that's gonna break down and be a lot easier for them. But like those hardwood mulches, they can be very difficult.
That's true. One more quick one, and then we've already reached our time limit,
Oh,
but
God.
I can't let this one because it's been asked a couple times, and we could go on all day long asking you questions. It's fascinating. But do leaf cutter bees live on leaves? I've seen them out in the garden. I see them take the little pieces away. I yell at them when they do it to my favorite plants. I still let them do it. But where do they live?
In tubes,
Okay.
in stems and things like that. As adults, they're just going back and forth to these stems because, again, as so many people think about insects as, and they do need space. They have activity, the things, but most adult insects, their whole drive is for that next generation, and that's what they are. Males, once they mate, they're gone. They stop. Most males live very short lives as adults because once they fulfill their function, they're done. So then what you're mostly seeing are females out there, and these females, their one drive in this world is to lay eggs, collect the food, and create the casings that need to be on it. And the more she does that, the better off she is. But that is literally her drive in life until she dies. So she's not just mostly hanging out unless she needs to rest. But really, they're going for these tubes, these natural reeds, these stems, or if you have these houses, like that's what they're doing all the time as adults, literally for about 2 months before they die.
Yeah, and then we miss it. We're all at least I'm very sad in the wintertime because I'd much rather be outside with the bees and the plants and the flowers. But thank you, Dr. Walker. We really appreciate this very interesting, very engaging presentation. You're a wealth of knowledge, and we at Smithsonian Gardens appreciate your professionalism and knowledge, and now the world knows that you exist, and I'm sure we're going to get some more questions from people as we go along. But I also wanted to promote my background. I really do not have a large caterpillar behind me, swallowtail caterpillar behind me, but we understand the importance of screensavers and backgrounds, virtual backgrounds on Zoom, since our life is on Zoom now. But we have these available on our website, again, gardens.si.edu. So if you'd like to find out more about us or see how large of information we have available on our website, or you just want this fabulous picture to put as a screensaver on your computer, please go to our website. Thank you to my helpers, Sarah and Sarah. You've done a great job with keeping us on track with the questions, and we hope that you will join us, all of you will join us again next week when we talk about native plants. And it'll be Alex Denker, one of our horticulturists, and he's going to give us his top 10 or top 20 choices for native trees, native plants and shrubs that will grow in shade and sun. Thanks to everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you guys for
Bye.
coming.
Thank you.